Welcome back. You are listening to the home of forbidden romances. Prepare yourself, because tonight's story will leave you breathless. The barrel of the gun was cold against Julian's temple, but the ice in Lysander Thorne's eyes when he walked through the warehouse doors was far colder. 3 days ago, Julian Vane was a nobody, a starving violinist scraping by in a damp studio apartment. Now he was kneeling on concrete stained with engine grease, his hands bound behind his back, looking up at the man he had publicly eviscerated on national television. Lysander didn't look at the thugs holding the weapons. He didn't even acknowledge the smell of gasoline and sweat that permeated the air. He simply adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke midnight blue suit, his gaze locking onto Julian with a terrifying, possessive intensity. It was the look of a predator finding its prey trapped in a snare intended for a lesser beast. "I told you." Lysander's voice was a low baritone that vibrated through the floorboards, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. The deal was for the weekend, and the weekend isn't over yet. To understand how Julian ended up with a gun to his head, one had to rewind 72 hours. It had started with a scream. Not a scream of fear, but of pure, unadulterated rage. Julian stood in the center of the gilded ballroom of the Grand Hotel. The charity gala was in full swing, a sea of diamonds, tuxedos, and fake laughter. And there, standing on the dais like a god surveying insects, was Lysander Thorne, the CEO of Thorne Industries, the man who had just signed the order to demolish the historic Conservatory of Arts, Julian's home, his sanctuary, the only place that had ever let a scholarship kid play a Stradivarius, to build a luxury parking structure. Julian hadn't planned it. The champagne had been free, and his grief had been raw. He had marched up to the dais, grabbed a microphone stand, and unleashed a tirade that would trend on social media for weeks. "You are a soulless parasite," Julian had screamed, his voice cracking with emotion, his finger pointing accusingly at Lysander's chest. "You eat beauty and shit out concrete. Do you even have a heart? Or is there just a calculator where your soul should be?" The silence that followed was absolute. Security had swarmed him a second later. But Lysander Thorne hadn't called for his arrest. He hadn't even blinked. He had just stared at Julian, his dark eyes unreadable, watching the security guards drag the flailing musician away. Now, Julian sat in a leather chair that cost more than his entire life's earnings. He was in the penthouse office of Thorne Tower. The view of the city was dizzying, a sprawling grid of lights that Lysander owned. Julian's hands were shaking. The adrenaline of the gala had worn off, replaced by the crushing reality of his situation. He was facing lawsuits for defamation, trespassing, and public disturbance. His landlord had evicted him this morning after the press camped out on the front lawn. He was ruined. The double doors opened, and Lysander walked in. Up close, the man was devastating. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained against the fabric of his suit. His hair was the color of raven feathers, swept back to reveal a face carved from marble, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes that were so dark they looked like voids. Lysander didn't sit behind his desk. He leaned against the edge of it, crossing his long legs, studying Julian. "You have a powerful set of lungs, Mr. Vane," Lysander said. "I'm not apologizing," Julian snapped, though his voice lacked its previous fire. "You destroyed the conservatory. Buildings crumble. Legacies fade. Money remains." Lysander dismissed it effortlessly. He picked up a tablet. "Defamation. Harassment. My legal team estimates you'll be in litigation for the next 10 years. You'll be bankrupt by Tuesday." Julian swallowed hard, looking away. "So? Do it. Crush me. That's what you do." "I could," Lysander murmured. He stood up and walked toward Julian. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, charged with a strange static. He stopped inches from Julian's chair, looming over him. "Or, I could make it all go away." Julian looked up, wary. "What do you want? My kidney? I want you." Julian choked on air. "Excuse me? For 72 hours. Lysander clarified, his expression impassive. My family is hosting a summit at our private estate on Blackwood Island. It is a wedding. My ex-fiancé, the man who left me at the altar 3 years ago to marry my stepsister, will be there. My father expects me to arrive broken, alone, and malleable to his business demands. Julian blinked, processing this. The titan of industry had daddy issues? You want a trophy boyfriend? Julian scoffed. Hire a model. You can afford 1,000 of them. Models are boring. They are trained to smile and agree, Lysander said, leaning down, his face inches from Julian's. Julian could smell him. Sandalwood, rain, and something sharp, like cold steel. You, Julian, are volatile. You hate me. You have fire in your eyes. When you look at me, you don't see a bank account. You see a monster. That passion. It looks remarkably like obsession to the untrained eye. Lysander extended a hand. Be my partner for the weekend. Convince them you are utterly captivated by me, and that I am captivated by you. Create a spectacle. Distract them. If you do this, I will drop the lawsuits. I will pay off your student debts. And I will donate a new wing to the arts district in your name. It was a deal with the devil. Julian knew it. But the thought of the debts vanishing, of saving music in the city. Julian took Lysander's hand. It was warm, calloused, and engulfing. One weekend, Julian whispered. But I still hate you. A ghost of a smile touched Lysander's lips. It was terrifyingly attractive. Good. Use that. Blackwood Island was a fortress of solitude and opulence, accessible only by helicopter. As they descended, Julian saw the sprawling Gothic mansion perched on the cliffs, battered by the gray ocean waves. It looked like the setting of a murder mystery, not a wedding. Rules, Lysander said over the headset as the chopper touched down. Physical touch is mandatory. We share a room. You call me Lysander, not Mr. Thorne. And if my father speaks to you, you answer with the same venom you used at the gala, but directed at his enemies. Why? Because the only thing my father respects is strength. If you cower, he will eat you alive. If you bite back, he will think you are worthy of me. They were greeted by a phalanx of staff. But the real threat waited in the drawing room. Silas Thorne sat by the fireplace, a withered man who looked like a vulture wrapped in silk. Beside him stood a woman who looked too much like a younger, softer version of Lysander, and a man, the ex-fiancé Julian assumed. He was handsome in a generic golden retriever way, but his eyes were weak. Lysander, Silas croaked. You're late. I was occupied, Lysander said, his hand sliding firmly onto the small of Julian's back. The heat of his palm burned through Julian's thin shirt. Father, this is Julian. My partner. The silence was heavy. The ex-fiancé, Daniel, looked Julian up and down with a mixture of jealousy and confusion. The screamer, Silas sneered. I saw the news. You brought a feral street cat to a wedding. Julian felt Lysander's muscles tense beside him. This was the test. Julian stepped forward, shrugging off Lysander's hand to stand independently. He looked Silas dead in the eye. Better a feral cat than a domesticated dog that rolls over for scraps, Julian said, his voice smooth and cold. He glanced briefly at Daniel, then back to Silas. Lysander likes a challenge. Perhaps that's why he bored of the options you provided him. Silas's eyes widened. Daniel choked on his drink. For a second, Julian thought he was dead. Then, a dry, rasping laugh erupted from Silas. Sharp, the old man muttered. Very sharp. Lysander stepped up beside Julian again, his arms snake-like around Julian's waist, pulling him flush against his side. He bites, Lysander murmured, his lips brushing Julian's ear. The intimacy sent a shiver down Julian's spine that had nothing to do with acting. The weekend was a blur of psychological warfare. Julian played the role of the devoted, fiery lover, and Lysander played the indulgent, obsessed tycoon. But it was in the quiet moments that the lines began to blur. Late that night, in the master suite, there was only one bed. a massive four-poster monstrosity draped in velvet. "I can sleep on the chaise," Julian offered, loosening his tie. He felt exhausted. The emotional labor of dealing with the Thorne family was draining. "Don't be ridiculous," Lysander said, unbuttoning his shirt. He revealed a torso that was scarred, faint, silvery lines across his ribs. Old wounds. "The bed is big enough." They lay in the dark, the sound of the ocean crashing against the cliffs below. "Why do you hate him?" Julian asked into the darkness. "Your father. He taught me that love is a transaction," Lysander replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "That people are assets. Daniel was the first person I thought saw me. But my father offered him a seat on the board to marry my sister, and he took it." Julian turned his head. In the moonlight, Lysander looked younger, less like a titan and more like a man who had been hollowed out. "He's an idiot," Julian whispered. Lysander turned to face him. "Is he? You're—" Julian hesitated. "You're intense and arrogant, and you tried to bulldoze my school. But you're not empty. I saw you looking at the violin in the hallway today. You looked at it like you wanted to touch it, but were afraid you'd break it." Lysander reached out, his fingers tracing the line of Julian's jaw. The touch was electric. "I break everything I touch, Julian. That is why I need to let you go on Monday. And if I don't want to go?" The words slipped out before Julian could stop them. Lysander's eyes darkened. He moved closer, his leg hooking over Julian's. "Don't toy with me, little violinist. You are playing a part." "I'm not acting right now," Julian breathed. Lysander kissed him. It wasn't gentle. It was a claiming, a desperate, hungry devourment. Julian melted into it, his hands tangling in Lysander's hair. Felt like falling off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The climax of the weekend was the reception. Julian had been asked to play. Lysander had procured a violin, a Guarneri worth millions, for him. As Julian played, pouring his confusion and newfound desire into the music, he saw Lysander watching him from the back of the room. The look on his face was raw, unguarded adoration. But the spell broke when Julian went outside for fresh air. 2 vans screeched up the driveway. Men in balaclavas poured out. These weren't Thorne security. They were rough, chaotic. Julian was grabbed before he could scream. A cloth soaked in chloroform was pressed to his face. The last thing he saw was the manicured lawn spinning away into darkness, which brought them to the warehouse. Julian's head throbbed. He had learned, through the boastful taunts of his captors, that this wasn't about Lysander's business rivals. It was about Julian's past. His father, a man Julian hadn't seen in years, had racked up gambling debts with the wrong loan sharks and named his son as collateral. When the news broke that Julian was dating a billionaire, the sharks decided to cash in. "Get on your knees," the leader of the thugs shouted, pressing the gun harder against Julian's temple. "Thorne." One step closer and his brains paint the floor. Lysander stopped. He stood in the center of the warehouse, surrounded by 6 armed men. He held his hands up, palms open. "Let him go," Lysander said softly. "His father's debt is 200,000. I have wired 5 million to your offshore account. Check your phone." The leader blinked, distracted. He pulled his phone from his pocket. 5 million? The thug stared at the screen. "Consider it a severance package," Lysander said, "because you won't live to spend it." In the split second the leader was distracted by the zeros on the screen, Lysander moved. It was a blur of violence. Lysander didn't move like a CEO. He moved like a soldier. He closed the distance, twisting the leader's wrist with a sickening crunch. The gun skittered across the floor. Julian scrambled back as chaos erupted. Lysander was a whirlwind of precision strikes. He disarmed one man, used him as a shield against another, and delivered a roundhouse kick that sent a third crashing into a stack of pallets. But there were too many of them. A thug swung a crowbar, catching Lysander in the ribs. Lysander grunted, stumbling. "No!" Julian screamed. Adrenaline surged through Julian. He spotted the loose gun on the floor. He didn't think. He dove for it. His hands, usually so delicate with a bow, wrapped around the cold steel. "Stop!" Julian yelled, pointing the gun at the man raising the crowbar for a killing blow. "Back off!" The thug froze, looking at the trembling violinist. Lysander used the distraction. He swept the man's legs out from under him and delivered a final, unconscious rendering blow to the temple. Silence fell over the warehouse. Bodies groaned on the floor. Lysander stood up, clutching his side. Blood stained his pristine white shirt. He looked at Julian, who was still holding the gun, chest heaving. "Julian," Lysander said, his voice ragged. "Put it down." Julian dropped the gun as if it burned him. He ran to Lysander, his hands hovering over the blood. "You're hurt. You idiot, you came alone? Why didn't you call the police?" "Police take too long," Lysander wheezed, leaning heavily on Julian. He cupped Julian's face with a bloody hand, smearing crimson on Julian's cheek. "I couldn't risk them hurting you. I couldn't risk the music stopping. You bought my debt?" Julian sobbed, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. $5 million? I would have paid $1 billion, Lysander whispered, resting his forehead against Julian's. "I told you. I'm obsessed." The aftermath. 2 days later, Julian sat in a hospital room. Lysander was propped up in bed, stitching healing nicely. The press was having a field day. Billionaire romance turns action movie. "The weekend is over," Julian said, standing by the window. "The deal is done. You saved me. I played my part." Lysander looked at him, the vulnerability gone, replaced by that familiar, calculating intensity. "Is it?" He pulled a folder from the bedside table. "I acquired the conservatory land back from myself. It is now a protected heritage site. And I have a new contract for you." Julian took the folder. It wasn't a business deal. It was a lease agreement for the penthouse. Co-signed. "I don't want a fake boyfriend, Julian," Lysander said, his voice low. "I realized that the moment you screamed at me. I don't want someone who fears me. I want the man who holds a gun to save me. I want the partner." Julian looked at the papers, then at Lysander, the man who had walked into a warehouse of armed men for him. Julian ripped the contract in half. Lysander's face fell, a rare look of shock crossing his features. "I don't need a contract," Julian said, walking over to the bed and sitting on the edge. He leaned in, careful of Lysander's ribs, and brushed his lips against the billionaire's. "I'm not a transaction, Lysander. If you want me, you just have to ask." Lysander let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. He wrapped his hand around the back of Julian's neck, pulling him down. "Stay," Lysander commanded, soft but firm. "Try and make me leave," Julian challenged, smiling against his lips. And that is how the violinist tamed the Titan. If you enjoyed seeing Lysander lose his control for love, destroy that like button. And tell me in the comments. Would you forgive a man who bought your debts but endangered your life? Or is that a red flag you'd run from? I'll be reading your answers. Subscribe for the next chapter. Until then.